Alright, this presentation will be for Chapter 19, Section 3, pages 466 to 471. As I mentioned previously, after the Civil War, millions of Americans started heading west to take advantage of the opportunities out there for jobs, to become landowners. Problem was that land was already inhabited by thousands and thousands of Native American people who felt that the land belonged to them, but the American government didn't really recognize their property rights, so to speak. So this led to a series of Indian wars between the homesteaders and the Native Americans, and these clashes led to numerous massacres throughout the late 1800s. Most of these massacres were of the Indian people. Some, though, were of the U.S. military forces were massacred, but basically clashes between the homesteaders and the Native Americans. Another problem was the near extinction of the bison or the buffalo. The white settlers used the buffalo they hunted it for sports, and then they would skin them and take the valuable furs and oftentimes just leave the carcass behind. The Native American people, however, depended on the buffalo for their very survival. They used every part of the buffalo, the skins for clothing and for shelter, the meat for food, the bones, the horns, everything, nothing went to waste. Everything was of some use to the Native American people. And once you take that away from them, their very way of life is going to be affected. To get an idea of the extent of this, in the early 1800s, there were about 15 million buffalo roaming the Great Plains. By 1890, they were nearly extinct. So that gives you some idea of how much the Indian people were suffering because they needed the buffalo to survive, and now that was being taken from them. Also, during this expansion into the American West, the U.S. government changed its whole policy toward the Native Americans, and they turned toward a policy of concentration, which meant that they were forcing them off their native lands and moving them onto what we call reservations, smaller and smaller areas of land where the Native American people were being forced to live. And lots of times it was land that was very barren and very hard to survive on. So they, had a very difficult time. Some tribes peacefully signed treaties and kind of willingly moved onto these lands in exchange for promises of food. The government said that, we would take care of you. We would make sure you would get food and supplies. Other tribes actually fought for their lands, and that's where some of these Indian wars were taking place. One of the problems was that life on the reservation generally was not very good because of the corrupt Indian agents. The Indian agents were supposed to be taking care of the native people living on the reservations on behalf of the U.S. government, but oftentimes they just took the money and they didn't give the native people the supplies that they were promised, or they would give them rotted food, or they would give them blankets that were, covered in lice and that kind of thing. So they were treated very badly. In 1887, the American government passes the Dawes Act, and that was an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into American culture. To assimilate means to basically kind of give up your own culture and adopt somebody else's. And this law led to the creation of Indian Territory that still exists today in the state of Oklahoma, but it drew up more and more of these reservations. Also, it tells you Native American children were forced to learn English and again to become more Americanized. Native American families again are forced off their homelands onto reservations. That shows you a poster there of the Indian land being sold, again taken away from the native peoples and then being sold so that the government could profit from that. And as I said, oftentimes these reservation lands were kind of barren areas, not good for any kind of farming or any way of life. But eventually they were found, a lot of these reservations were found to have gold and silver and became targets for the mining corporations. So the Indian people kept being moved from one place to another because The land once thought to be worthless is now found to be very valuable because of its mining interests. This is a picture kind of illustrating the idea of assimilation. These are the same three boys. They're in their Native American clothing and then being forced to assimilate and to become more Americanized. And you can see they're dressed as American boys might be dressed. But their culture was, the attempt was to destroy their culture and to take away their way of life and make them be more like Americans, more civilized, the government would have said. This shows you, remember that whole central part of the United States, the Great Plains, that had been open ground for the Native American people. Now they've been forced onto all these reservations. You can see the different purple areas there that they're being sent to. Also, you can see the sites of the major battles that had been happening, and we'll look at a couple of these in particular, but you can see where that's all happening as well. The Nez Perce were a Native American tribe settled along the Oregon-Idaho border, and they were being chased off their lands, and basically they were trying to escape to Canada. That's the Nez Perce chief, Chief Joseph. He refused to move from his lands onto the reservation at first, and they were trying to escape to Canada, and they were chased all the way there until they were finally caught along the border, and Chief Joseph was captured. Many of his people were killed in fighting that happened there. Custer's Last Stand is one of the more famous of the massacres that happened, also known as the Battle of Little Bighorn. This was in 1876. That's George Armstrong Custer. He was a lieutenant general. He fought in the American Civil War for the Union forces and then went off into the West to fight the Indians in the Indian Wars. And what happened in this particular battle was he had about 200 men with him, and they went up against a force of almost 5,000 Sioux and Cheyenne, and they were surrounded and ambushed, and they were killed. And it became known as Custer's Last Stand because he and all of his troops were massacred. These are some of the famous Indian chiefs that you're going to be reading about in your section. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse from the Sioux and Cheyenne, Red Cloud and Geronimo. All of them eventually captured and then killed by U.S. military forces. All right, looking at a few of the massacres in particular, Sand Creek in 1864, the Army persuaded the Cheyenne to stop raiding and to return to their reservation in Colorado. But the Army basically tricked them. They got them on the reservation, and then U.S. military forces came and ambushed them and killed them all and burned their camp. Congress condemned the military actions, but nobody was punished for it. Next, again, you had the Battle of Little Bighorn, as I said. The Sioux responded to the government relocation by joining other tribes. Then the Native Americans slaughtered George Armstrong Custer's smaller U.S. force. And then lastly, you had the Battle of Wounded Knee. At this place, Army troops captured Sitting Bull's followers, took them to a camp at Wounded Knee Creek. There was fighting, and then eventually the U.S. military forces slaughtered all the Native American men, women, and children. When news got out about the massacre, American people were shocked about the brutality of this, that women and children were being killed also. And that was pretty much the last of the Indian Wars. After this, the Native American people kind of gave up as far as resisting and moved on to the reservations that they were forced onto.